my name is Safia. I'm a software engineer here at Microsoft working on minimal APIs.
And I'm Stefan, and I'm also an engineer at Microsoft working on minimal APIs. And we're excited to tell you what's happening in .NET 7 and go a little bit over what's happened already. So the agenda for this presentation is to talk about what's happened kind of in the distant past, still ASP.NET Core, what happened in the last release of .NET 6, because that was a big release for minimal APIs, and then what's in store for .NET 7, because it's built. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about like how we got here in the past. So before we started working on what we've been calling minimal APIs, we started extracting features from MVC. And this is around the ASP.NET Core 3.0 timeframe, is when the routing authorization in cores basically all got extracted out of MVC into something that can be used by SignalR, mapget, and still also used from MVC controllers, Blazor, et cetera. So basically, we noticed that a lot of web frameworks and web applications wanted features that you typically had to use MVC before to get. So to get useful fast routing tables, to enable things like cores, to enable the authorization pipeline. These were all things that prior to 3.0, you really wanted an MVC app to do, or each framework basically had to redo that kind of work, and there would be different ways to do it. So the way you would have noticed this in the 3.0 templates is in your startup class, inside your configure method, you would have started calling use routing, and that would do your route matching. That would make sure that, when you're making a request to the root, you're writing hi, right? And like this can, in this example, accept cores requests, and it will be authenticated if you added the right metadata. So this is all stuff that there's no MVC there, but this is showing, except for map controllers, but this is showing that mapget can basically leverage those same features. Now, in 3.0, there were a few things that we weren't able to get to. For example, in mapget, there was no way to serialize an object that you returned. So here we're returning a string, which is nice. But when you're writing APIs, oftentimes you want to use JSON or something like that. There's no model binding. You notice that the parameter to mapget there is an HTTP context. So it's a very powerful HTTP context. You can read the request body, the path, the query string, that kind of thing. But it's not nearly as convenient as, say, an MVC action. And furthermore, like your mapget endpoints, for example, your SignalR endpoint, so forth, wouldn't show up in your like Swagger output. So this is like, MVC's API Explorer, if you might have heard of that. OpenAPI is, the real name now for Swagger, even though it's still Swagger in JSON. And these were things that we were hoping to do in the future. It was something already considered in the .NET 3 time plan, but wasn't done. And it's always basically been this effort of extracting features from MVC has been focused a lot towards API scenarios. We feel that MVC is great for views and HTML helpers, or Blazor for that matter. Like they are opinionated for how they do templating and so forth. So far, we're not planning to extract those features, but that's kind of what we did prior to .NET 6. But in .NET 6, we made a lot more progress with minimal route handlers, and Safia is here to talk about that.
Yeah, .NET 6 was definitely the landmark leap for minimal APIs. In fact, it's when we first officially released minimal APIs out in .NET 6. Now, if you haven't had the chance to try out minimal APIs yet, this is an example of what a minimal API application looks like. Here it is literally 4 lines of code, plus or minus a few for white space and formatting. But it's a simple and straightforward way to create API-based applications using .NET. And this simplification didn't really happen in isolation within the ASP.NET Core team. What I think is really interesting about this effort is that it is part of a collection of features that have landed in .NET 6 and in the C# language to make it a lot easier and simpler to build applications. Some of these features are language features like top-level statements that reduce a lot of the cruft that you needed. Your program main, your program class, your main static method, all of that is gone now. You can get straight to business logic of your core application. Simplifications in the way that you instantiate a web application host, as well as improvements to the way that you register endpoints. We introduced a collection of map methods that allow you to register endpoints using a variety of those RESTful verbs. So these are changes that happened across the language, across .NET, and across ASP.NET Core to make minimal APIs a lot simpler and easier to use in .NET 6. So we shipped it out to the world in .NET 6. People started using it, playing around with it. We got some feedback, and we fully realized that part of software is improving it and making it better. And there's definitely a lot of features that we are chasing and looking to introduce into minimal APIs for .NET 7. And Stefan and I want to give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what those are here today. So first and foremost, we want to start talking about endpoint filters. If you have a background with MVC, you might be familiar with the filter concept, which is essentially a construct that allows you to intercept the invocation of your core handler logic, inspect any parameters that were provided, maybe in the route or in the body, short circuit it if you need to. Maybe you want to do some validation or some logging there. All of that is supported in filters in MVC. And one of the things that we knew we wanted to do going into .NET 7 was add support for filters with minimal APIs. And we did just that in Preview 3. So this is already shipped and is out in the world if you try out the 7.0 Preview 3 of .NET 7. You can add a filter to any endpoint that is registered on your application. Here I have a to-dos endpoint, and I've added a filter that is going to validate the to-do that the user is attempting to post to the endpoint. And this filter, I can do a variety of things. I could log. I can do what I've done here, which is do some validation. And what's really interesting to see here is that you have access to a lot of interesting primitives within this context. So I can get the method info or details about the handler that was registered with the endpoint. So I can say, if my handler looks a certain way, like let's say it takes an integer, unique identifier in the row, and it takes a body parameter that is a to-do, I want you to always apply this logic. So it gives you the flexibility to register filters onto a variety of endpoints. And then you have access to the actual parameters and context of the invocation. So if a user sends a request to an endpoint with an ID1 and a to-do that contains a certain title and is done state, you can access all of those within your filter. So you have access to the particular invocation context of the handler, as well as access to the route handler itself. This shift in Preview 3, we're continuing to make more improvements to the filter experience. Improvements were shipped in Preview 4. And as people try it out, like you, and we get more feedback, this is an area that we're going to be continuing to refine for filters. The other thing that Steph had mentioned a little bit earlier was API Explorer and OpenAPI support. OpenAPI is a specification for annotating APIs with information about the types of parameters they take, the types of responses that an API endpoint will return. And it's a really great way for teams to document their APIs if they're sharing them internally, or even if they have APIs that they are shipping publicly, if you provide some sort of API service. One of the challenges that we've always had with MVC and early on in minimal in .NET 6 is making sure that we can support the full spectrum of OpenAPI annotations. The OpenAPI specification is very rich. You can define all sorts of things. For example, you can define that a type takes a particular parameter given a particular format. with particular validations like the minimum length or the maximum length of a string. So it's a really rich specification. And we always struggle to have full support for all aspects of the specification in the annotations that we generated ourselves. So moving forward, one of the things that we decided to do is provide more first-class support for OpenAPI in a new package that we're calling Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI. I know, I love it when the name is very reflective of what the package does. And this provides you and any users with the ability to generate and modify OpenAPI annotations across the full spectrum. So instead of relying on the minimal APIs framework to generate those definitions, you can instead take a pre-generated template that we produce and then modify it. So you can see in the code sample here, I've got an endpoint that takes a string parameter that's a name, and I can access the OpenAPI description that's pre-generated by minimal APIs using the with API description method. And then I can enhance and annotate it for all of the different properties that exist in the OpenAPI schema. So here I'm editing the summary of the description, as well as the summary associated with one of the responses. And I can drill down as much as I want to. I can edit the parameters type. I can edit the requiredness of the parameter. Anything that's supported by OpenAPI is supported with this experience. So that's pretty darn neat. And you can try this out as far as or as low as the 7.0 Preview 4 SDK, trying out this experience by including the Microsoft ASP.NET Core OpenAPI package in your application. So that's the support for OpenAPI that's coming in .NET 7, as well as new features and enhancements to endpoint filters. And if you think that's a whole host of features that are fun to ship, we've actually got more in store, including something that Stefan has been working on for the past few weeks, which is support for route groups.
Thanks, Safia. Yeah, route grouping is an exciting new feature. Early on in .NET 6, when people started really using minimal route handlers, we got the feedback that it was missing a grouping functionality. So when you're writing a controller, it's very easy using attribute routing to specify a route prefix. So maybe you have a to-dos controller, and at the top, you'll have a route to-dos. And that will, be the prefix, right, to all the actions on the controller. So if you've written controllers, that's something that you might be familiar with. It also allows you to basically say maybe require auth, right, or allow cores for an entire controller. So far in .NET 6, if you wanted to do something similar to that, you have to basically apply the auth attribute or call require auth on every single endpoint that needs it. And there's no way to be like, hey, here's a group of endpoints, apply it to it all. So route groups are designed to solve that pain point. So it allows you to have a single route prefix for a group of endpoints and then call require authorization, require cores, things of that nature with group name. And it will apply to all the endpoints in that group. What's kind of cool about route groups, maybe as opposed to controllers, is that you can nest these. So, you could almost imagine, we'll see on the next slide. And much like controllers, there's a structure that's basically implied automatically. What's interesting is you can call map controllers with the route group, but let's go to the next slide and just see what the syntax looks like for this. All right, so here you'll see that there's a new method called map group, which in this case, we're creating an organizational group that has an org slug, as we call it, right? So that can be basically any string until the next /, which in this demo is the name of your organization. And we're going to require that anyone who wants to interact with org-specific endpoint is going to need to be authorized. So this now will apply to the remaining endpoints in this sample. The to-dos is an example of a nested group. So now we have a group of to-do endpoints that are within an org. We're going to allow cores requests. So that means cross-domain requests, so you can make fetch API calls from different websites. Maybe they need to grab to-dos for a widget or something. And here you can simply add to-do to the org, or you can get all the to-dos for an org. Obviously, you'd want more endpoints than this for a real to-do app. You'd also actually want to set off auth and cores in your services, but for demo purposes, I'm just showing you the relevant map group code. So one thing you'll notice is the string org parameter that is at the beginning of each of these map post and map get route handlers. So that org comes from the outer group. So we know which organization you belong to. In real life, you do validation to make sure the user's really supposed to be in the org they say they are and that kind of thing. But this is now available to you on the route. So if you make a request to org to-dos and you post a to-do, this will add that to-do. It'll make sure it ends up in the proper org in your database. Again, database needs to really be set up, but we're trying to fit this all in the slide. So, so the nice thing here is in a controller, say you had like a org controller or to-dos controller, right? And you wanted to allow cores. Today, you could put a cores attribute at the top of the controller and apply to all the endpoints. Now, you can save that code. And so now, both the endpoints at the bottom of the sample will use the allow all cores policy, which allows all requests if you set it up that way. There are other things you can see that for everyone in the org, we basically are versioning our API with group name. There's some more setup there with Swashbuckle to make that work, but all these APIs are V1 in the sample. So instead of calling map post dot require authorization when we're done, that is happening automatically. So this is what we're planning to ship in preview 4. Still needs to be merged, so hopefully that code just works as written. It does right now in my branch, but this is the goal. And so super excited to see how that plays out, get your feedback. On the next slide, we talk about what we want to do in future previews. So right now, a lot of extension methods like require authorization and require cores can already be applied to an entire group. However, there is a pattern for things like map post and map get that we return a route handler builder that has special extension methods like adding filters that Safi just showed or OpenAPI metadata. So what's interesting about that is those filters, right, don't apply to any kind of endpoint. So you're not going to be able to call like map controller add filter because controllers have their own filter pipeline, and the add filter stuff Safi just showed you were for minimal route handlers. So you can call map controller in a group because it uses the same shared routing as everything else does. That's what we were talking about in the past, is we have this shared infrastructure, which allows groups to work the way it does. So it allows a shared route table for things like map-get and MVC actions. So it does mean that typically after you call map controller, there are special APIs that you can call to customize MVC. And same thing with add filters and so forth. But those require special types, right? So like these special kind of endpoints support these special kind of features like filters. So we want to be able to select just the endpoints that support a given feature from a group and then customize those features. So that's something that's still in design. That's why there's no sample code for how this works. I had proposed some ideas, but we're still working. Follow the ASP.NET Core repo to see how that goes. But I'm confident we'll come up with a solution for that. And then another thing that's kind of tricky for groups is adding normal middleware. So all the things that I've talked about to this point, which as far as like the metadata that can be applied to entire groups, so cores and authorization, are broad. And the same thing is those are relying on this route table. Middleware is much more generic. Instead of being a final endpoint, it can be, like in the case of use static files, right? You can just serve the static file directly. And that's something that you'd really want to be able to put like a path prefix on. So we want to make stuff like that work. Also, like use exception handler actually calls through and basically, for those of you who are familiar with ASP.NET, it calls through a next method. And that is, the middleware that gives you nicer error pages than a blank 500, right? And it'd be nice, like, if you could, again, customize that towards an entire group. For technical reasons, this is a challenge to make work, to kind of consolidate middleware that can work with arbitrary requests with endpoints that rely on the route table. But I think this is a feature that a lot of people will want, and we're super excited to make that work, but it will not be available in Preview 4. So moving on, for things that are actually going to be available in Preview 4, but are still in PR, are typed results. So this is feedback that we got early on in .NET 6. So in this .NET 6 example, you can see code that would work today that returns, to-dos to stick with the theme. So if it finds a to-do, it returns it. If not, it returns a not found. So 200 or 404. And right now, to make sure that shows up with OpenAPI, you can use extension methods. And then in the future, right, you'll be able to use Safia's OpenAPI features that will allow even better control over this kind of metadata. But that doesn't mean we're giving up on using the type system to figure out what you're returning to begin with. So because results methods, so you see in the top example, there's results.ok and results.notfound, return iResult, which is an interface without any real members. It's hard, or should I say impossible, in .NET 6 to determine at startup, when we need to, what status codes that top method might return, unless we add it by doing something like produces status code 404 not found. In the bottom example, you'll notice instead of returning results.ok and results.notfound, we were returning typed results.ok and typed results.notfound. The API is still under review. I think that's where we're going to land, but we're definitely targeting Preview 4 for this release. So with these types, we're trying to pick short names. You'll notice that we picked OK and not found as the name. If you look at the return type of that lambda, you'll see that unlike in the first example, that's fully specified. So this is returning a new generic type called results. And this is saying that we're returning actually one of two types. It's basically a union, but there's no C# feature for it. So we have a generic type. And this, it says that we're returning either an OK of to do or a not found. And these are both still iResults, but the signature of typed results.ok say that it's OK and not an iResult. OK happens to be an iResult, so it works the same way. But we can statically analyze that, hey, an OK iResult is a 200 status code, a not found iResult is a 404 status code. And this does the exact same thing as the .NET 6 example above, but with less code. You just have to specify the return type. And that becomes even more convenient if you're using name methods. You're specifying the return type already anyway. So that's one of the last features that we were super excited to talk about coming in .NET 7. There are more. If you like web application builder, there's host application. There's tons of fixes we've done in MVC, but they don't all fit on this slide deck. So we just want to thank you for your time. And Safi, you got anything to add?
No, I think it's really exciting to see all of the different features that we've been working on. Of course, it's not just Stefan and I on the team. We've got a host of other engineers who are shipping improvements across MVC, the results work that you just showed, and community members. ASP.NET Core and Minimal APIs is open source, so we have people who are using these previews, sharing their feedback, and actually submitting fixes and enhancements and bug reports to it already. So it's really cool to see the collaborative effort come in to make it happen.